Imagine yourself at high noon in the square of a large city, and you're about to witness the unveiling of Picasso's last great sculpture. Crowds have been gathering. The newspapers have been doing a large number on it for a large time. There's a group of court reporters sitting on the portico of the courthouse. Photographic Society has cameras stationed all the way around the square. Many people have come from art classes, and at last the dedication ceremonies began. Speeches began to the citizens who have made the possible, this sculpture, this square, and finally the scaffolding drops, the crowd gets quiet, and everyone has a look at this really beautiful piece of art. Now, what one sees depends on where one stands. Where in the particular place, whether you're up high, down low, where you stand. What you see also depends on who you are. Are you an art critic? Are you a photographic critic? Are you interested mostly in writing a letter home to mother, telling her about this very special day? What is your point of view? Who are you? Where do you stand? And what is your mode of communication about what it is that you experienced? And so as we take this metaphor of watching the grand unveiling of a large three-dimensional sculpture, and we imagine that during the course of time, the sun changes the sculpture itself. By the time the moon comes out, the moon passes over, the shadows change it. So with the passing of time, with perspective, with who you are, with how you might want to communicate to someone else, all of what you see and what you experience changes. And of course, those of you who have done your homework now in physics, quantum physics, you're aware that we now look at the universe from a number of different vantage points. Applying this metaphor to psychology, to psychotherapy, the question still is, with each of us who's a therapist, who are we? That gives us a certain perspective, a certain vantage point on what we listen to. What is our particular vantage point? Through what lens are we looking at what we hear? And if we're going to try to talk to other people about it, what are the theories? What are the words? What are the symbols that we use in order to try to communicate? And so we become aware that our ideas may be stemming from 17th century, from Newton, and 19th century science, that there is a certain thing called the human being and a certain idea called the mind, and we can now look at the mind objectively and study it objectively. These are myths of the past. We're now aware, post-Einstein, post-quantum physics, post-chaos theory, that who we are, where we stand, what tools we use to observe, what tools and concepts we use to communicate determine what the beast is that we're looking at. And so today, in the course of the day, I want to try to introduce you to some contemporary ways that psychoanalysts have come to listen to people, and to the theme that has sort of characterized my work for 2 decades, listening perspectives, the idea being that over time we have evolved a series of different perspectives, different vantage points, different ways to look and to listen to the people that come to our consulting room. So in the course of the day, I'd like to this morning review briefly something of the philosophy of science behind the way we look and listen in psychotherapy today. Then I'd like to move to the 4 different developmental listening perspectives that have been defined so far. And then the bulk of today is going to be some lengthy, in-depth cases. And I think some of you today were looking forward to that, in that I know a number of you have either read my books or been at other presentations, so you know the basic take on science that I have. But the question is, how do we begin to apply that? So there will be several short cases we'll look at, and 3 long cases in the course of the day. And the 3 cases that we're going to look at in depth are cases which we might say are dealing with lower level, that is developmentally earlier, developmental arrests, so that they are going to be more in the what's called the borderline or the psychotic range of development, and how some of the transference and countertransference aspects can be worked with. So we've got a long day, a lot of things to cover. It's fairly intense. But where I think I want to start and begin to focus you on is that it is important to begin to think in terms of these 4 different angles from which we might listen to anybody that comes to our consulting room. And so the 4 different angles I'm going to go through in a bit of detail. So the question then is, why listening perspectives? The philosophy behind it really comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein. His comment is this: the general form of propositions is, this is how things are. That is, since time immemorial, we look at something and say, aha, this is the truth, this is reality, this is the mind, this person is this kind of a person or that person. Our DSM is fond of saying this is a narcissist, this is borderline, this person is bipolar. So there is a general way of speaking that says this is the way things are. That's the kind of proposition that one repeats to oneself countless times. One thinks that one is tracing the outline of the thing's nature, a real hysteric, a real borderline, over and over again. But one is merely tracing around the frame through which we look at it. And that's really, I think, the philosophical underpinning that all of science is moving to today, realizing that it is our frame for perception that determines what we see, and what then are going to be the most useful frames that we know of at this point in time to conceptualize our clinical and theoretical work. Why listening perspectives? This is the forecast for this morning. First thing I want to do is to look at the paradigm shift in psychoanalysis. That is, what are the features that really characterize the way we look and listen to clinical work today. Then we will look at the 4 listening perspectives as they've evolved over a century. Then we'll talk about the origins of countertransference and a little bit about the first case of analysis, NO. And then we're going to look at the varieties of countertransference. One of the features that I think strikes us most about modern clinical work is more than ever we are paying attention to our countertransference. We know that we are a person in the room with a real background, a real history, with real feelings, and that particular reality that we take in the room determines what it is we see, hear, and how we respond. So the countertransference has become increasingly important. So we'll talk about the varieties of countertransference, and then particularly the kind of countertransference that we have to organizing level or the earliest level of mental development. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we can do some interpretation of the countertransference, and then we'll take a break. And after the break, we'll look at the case of Dora, which is a case that I treated some years ago in which there was an erotic transference that posed some countertransference problems for me, and I'll be showing you how I blew the case completely. All right? Okay. That's going to be reassuring, is it? Okay. Let's see, we'll move right down here. All right. As we begin to take a long shot of our work, before we focus in on specific cases, I want to talk then about the way in which we're now beginning to hear clinical material. We used to hear it as from a medical framework. That is, that psychological difficulties were some sort of a disease entity, that there was some illness. And the illness model, which may have started us off well in psychotherapy, I don't think I have to mention anyone in this room, doesn't serve us very well anymore. That is, the whole notion that there is a disease, a treatment, and a cure puts us in a certain framework of thinking. And so long as we're thinking in a medical model, it's more than just a metaphor, it's a whole way of limiting our mind. And the example I often use here is sexist language. That is, at this point in time, we're very well aware that so long as we continue to use the third person singular masculine pronoun indiscriminately in our speech, that's not only the way we talk, it's the way we think, and ultimately it's the way we are and the way we live our lives. And so by beginning to change our speech, changing our action, changing our behavior, changing our movement, we change then who we are and the way that we relate to one another. So the same is true, I think, for the medical model. So we're now moving out of the idea of there being illness and cure into the idea that what we're doing in psychotherapy is raising our consciousness about who we are. And what does consciousness mean? It's a Greek word meaning knowing together. And so consciousness meaning knowing together is when 2 or more people are gathered in a room, begin to tell stories to one another about something very important or about who I am. And as we begin to tell the story together or formulate ideas together, a certain form of knowing, a certain consciousness, a consensus begins to evolve. And it is that consciousness raising that we're working for in psychotherapy. And the question is going to be what that consciousness is going to look like. The second feature of the paradigm shift today that we're working on is from scientific objectivity to subjectivity. That is, we used to believe that we actually knew the truth of things. Now we realize that it is subjectivity that is going to count. The way a person grew up, the way a person experienced themselves, and the paradigm shift now is going to be self in relationship to other. When we go back in the history of time, we realize that Freud, as early as 1895, started thinking about the mind in terms of the way the organism receives stimulation from the outside world and the way the organism receives stimulation from the inside of the body, and then a central processing system. So Freud's first model of the mind focused on how we map the external world, how we map the internal world, and how we link the two. But by 1900, in his book on dreams, he began to realize that it was the unconscious aspect that he was particularly interested in. So the second thought paradigm in psychoanalysis contrasts unconscious motivation, that is, motivation that is without time, without space, that is acausal, the kind of motivation that appears in our dreams, and contrasting that with our conscious, waking, secondary causal thought processes. So Freud then, for the next 20 years, formulated, and his early colleagues, in terms of an unconscious process. But by 1923, Freud began to raise the question of what is it that makes it possible for human beings to say I, the ego. How is it that we can say I, and what exactly do we mean when we say I, and how do we contrast that form of personal agency, the I that sees things, that does things, that moves, from another kind of agency that we have to own that lives inside of us, our biological heritage, our instincts, if you will, the it that lives us versus the I that I live my life with, and then the social consciousness, the so-called superego. So then for a great many years in psychoanalysis, the emphasis was on three different kinds of personal agency. That is, the I that acts, the it that lives me, and the over-I, or the super-I, that comes from social influences. By the 1950s, we find that Heinz Hartmann and Edith Jacobson and many others began to formulate our theory in a very different way. And they opened up the fourth paradigm for psychoanalytic thinking, the one that we're in today, which would be self and other representations. That is, it finally began to occur to us that it doesn't take a baby very long to realize where the bread is buttered. It's going to be on the other person, and we assume that babies already realize that in the womb, but certainly by the time they're born. And so that relationship becomes really the way in which the human mind is organized. Now, after the fact, we think, why didn't we realize that all the way along? But at the time, when people were developing ideas about the mind, different ideas came first. So that relationship is the point that we are at now in our psychoanalytic understanding, and regardless of what school of psychotherapy you're practicing now, you begin to become aware that self and other, or relationship, becomes a central pillar to your work. Inner child implies the same thing. That is, that there is an inner sense that has been living on since childhood. It is a way that I experience myself conscious and unconsciously, and it is a way that I move through the world. And so people who want to say do inner child work or parent tape work do the same sort of thing using a slightly different language. So we're aware now as psychotherapists, we speak many different languages, but the language that we have in common is the language of relationship. How do I experience myself in relationship to you, and how does that change in the course of a relationship that begins to develop? So the movement then is away from what is the truth of any particular person to how many ways can we look at the problem of relationships, and how does systematic subjectivity become an important part of the way that we think. The next feature that characterizes a contemporary thought is the movement from an emphasis on historical truth to narrative truth. Early on, the psychoanalysts, and actually a great many people even today, are still working on going back to the idea, if we just knew really what happened back then, we would understand what's wrong with us, and we'd have some understanding of what needs to be fixed or what sort of a curative experience one needs to have. These are ways of thinking that are common today. Where we're moving, though, more and more is back to the realization that the critical truths of humankind throughout the ages have always been present in myth, archetype, stories. And when we begin to tell truths about ourselves, we begin to tell stories. This happened to me then. I remember that then. And so the truth of human nature is less something that is historically accurate and more something about the way we tell ourselves. And how many times are we aware we'll be telling something about ourselves, and right in the middle of it we'll be aware that there's a gap, or there's something missing, or that we're distorting something, or we just added something that didn't quite happen that way. Well, we work very hard at having our stories move with cause and effect sequences. Like good psychologists, we try to tell stories that have beginnings, middle, and end, and that the stories have characters, that have motivations, and that there's going to be a good conclusion. We all know what a good narration is, but our internal lives don't quite work according to narration, so we end up forcing the facts of our lives and the facts of our feelings into a narrational format, and then often find that we have stories that contradict themselves, stories that don't quite make sense, and so we work very hard to make them make sense. But every one of you as clinicians, every day, hears somebody starting on a story, and right in the middle of the story, something will interrupt. Perhaps tears will begin to flow. Perhaps there'll be a blank. Perhaps the person will forget something. Perhaps suddenly another thought will come to mind. Perhaps a person will switch personalities. And so we're aware that stories are not quite so smooth as we'd like to think they are, but it's in the glitches in the stories, it's in the discontinuities, it's in the uncertainties that we experience as human beings that we really truly begin to find who we are. Is this objective truth? I don't think so. Is this science? I don't think so. We can perhaps apply scientific paradigms to the study of what happens when we fall into uncertainty, when we fall into fear, when we lose track of what our thoughts are. But finally, we're trying to discover ourselves through stories that we tell each other. The next feature of the paradigm shift is the shift from relativity to quantum realities. That is, even Einstein felt that the universe made sense, that it was cause and effect, that nothing went faster than the speed of light, but it's really the quantum physicists and the chaos physicists that have said we live in a universe that we do not understand. And some of you, if you haven't started reading quantum physics, now's the time to do it. When you go to the bookstore, you're going to find dozens of books that are quite readable to lay people in physics, and they're going to tell a fascinating story of what's been going on in the last 200 years as we have puzzled out what sort of a universe that we live in, really coming to the rather dramatic conclusion now that we do not know. And worse, we may never know. And so the question there that the physicists are moving to, first of all, they were now writing science fiction stories and religious texts because they began to realize that the Eastern people understood much long before we did the ways and the mysteries of the universe that are only now becoming clear through physics. So that in our field, the application of that is that we no longer assume that we know what the human being is about, that we know what the mind is about, or that we have a firm fix on psychology, but that we're always trying to establish new vantage points from which to look, to listen, and to understand without ever assuming that we know any particular truth. We're then also wanting to move, number 5, from mythical beast to listening perspectives. That is, there has been an attempt for many years to try to say what sorts of pathology exist. And in the old days, it was rather simple. We just had witches. We could burn them at the stake, and that solved that problem. But then as we began to have insane asylums, we began to notice that these witches took on a number of different casts with different sorts of stories. And so then we had various forms of schizophrenia, various forms of affective illness, a number of different diseases that evolved until finally we're where we are today with the DSM, which you know is a big fat volume, reads like a botany book, although I have called it the Noah's Ark of mythical beasts. Because as we read the DSM, we realize that every description is a description that doesn't fit anybody living or dead. And yet as we read through it, we find ourselves on every page. So somewhere between the DSM being a rich compendium of human possibilities, okay, and a very limited sort of botanical picture of the ways in which these species go, we begin to realize that we can't really rely in psychotherapy or in thinking about ourselves or in other people on such a particular way of organizing things objectively. So that really we're then caught with how many different ways can we establish to look at people without assuming that we know what we're seeing and without using mythical beast kinds of categories. And one of the last implications of this is as we begin to move away from there being one truth and one way to look at things with one frame, we then move to variable responsiveness. The original frame in psychotherapy was formed with high developed neurotic people in mind. That is, in the earliest psychoanalysts, they were working on very well developed minds. But as we have extended psychotherapy to look at people who have experienced developmental problems at a great many places earlier in life, say than the neurotic period, we've had to extend our frame to encompass other kinds of listening. And psychotherapists have always intuitively known this, but it's taken a while for our theory to catch up with us. And so hopefully what I'm going to do today is to systematize for you things that you already intuitively know and work with every day. So the four different listening perspectives that I think have evolved over a century that I'm going to encourage us to think about could be thought of as developmental sequences. And I'm going to look at them in reverse order because this is the way we've discovered them historically. That is, the listening perspective 4 was the one that started really before the turn of the last century with the so-called study of neurosis. Freud and his colleagues set up this particular listening perspective, and this would be, if you will, starting with the mind of about a 5-year-old child, where 5-year-old children know pretty well how the world is constructed. They can come in from outdoors and tell you a story that's pretty coherent, and you ask them about their feelings, they can tell you what that's about. So by the time we've got a 5-year-old child that's fairly well developed, the 5-year-old child has a mind that knows and it's connected to its body and it can symbolize its truth, its feelings, its experiences quite well. And so this has been called self and other constancy in the sense that the child has a certain constant way of looking at the world. He or she is moving fairly independently in the world and able to report experiences fairly independently. We'll come back to each of these four in detail. Number 3 would go back to about the 3rd year of life, and this is the listening perspective that Heinz Kohut par excellence and the self-psychologists have helped us evolve. In this particular one, it would be the see me, see me, see me quality of a 3-year-old who needs to affirm who she or he is through the eyes of important other people. And so the emergent self then is dependent on the other for confirmation. Going down the developmental ladder, down to the 4th to 24-month-old level, this is the period that's been called the period of the symbiosis. It's a period in which we talk about a mother and child, or parent and child, being mutually dependent in their relationship. And then the earliest one is going to go back to, I say, plus or minus 4 months from birth, the personality and organization. Infant research is now telling us that babies do a lot of organizing before birth, that there are a lot of aspects of their mind that are already activated. They're already listening, they're already aware of people in their environment, and they're aware of a great many things that we never thought they were aware of before. So that the organizing channels begin really with conception. First, organizing channels to mother's body, and then slowly, certainly by the last trimester, beginning to organize channels to her mind and to the minds of others. And in the first 3 or 4 months of life, we see babies actively involved in finding minds of others outside themselves. In fact, Joyce McDougall has even said that the first and the primary task of a baby is to learn to read its mother's unconscious. And I think we could certainly see the wisdom of that for a baby. So let's look then at the 4 listening perspectives with some detail. And I want to run down each one of these because where I want to go today is to talk about what affects us, again, regardless of the kind of psychotherapy we do, which is ultimately going to be the transfer of emotional experience from the past into the present, and then what the therapist's response to that emotional response from the past is, and then how the person may want to resist it. I believe there's a yellow chart there, and I've got them all on one page. Okay? Kind of a yellowish orange. Got it? Okay? And this is the first part of that chart. So in this first listening perspective, we're going to be listening to the most primitive part of a person's mind. Now, what you're going to be aware of today, as you listen to me, is that I'm not too interested in talking about a diagnosis of someone who is psychotic. I'm talking about the psychotic part of all of us. I'm talking about the part of us that had a project of trying to reach out, find the mother, other, the parent, and somehow in the course of reaching out did not successfully find the other person. All babies have that experience. With good enough parenting, we may be able to pass through to other developmental levels rather than to be stuck back there, but that doesn't mean that parts of our mind were not limited or stopped at that early level. So one of the things that I think has surprised psychotherapists over time would be that we would have someone come into our consulting room presenting a very well-developed personality, and as the relationship, as the intimacy of the relatedness begin to evolve, the person began to show us more and more primitive parts of their mind. And it used to be we think, oh, well, then I misdiagnosed this person. This person isn't well-developed, but they're really quite primitive. But the longer we stay in this business, we begin to realize that, no, that's not true. There are primitive parts to all of our minds. And if you want to know where yours are, I've often said, ask the people who live with you, they will tell you. Okay? That is that as we go down to our deeper developmental levels, we experience them usually in more intimate relationships. So this deepest level then, the traditional diagnosis of the organizing personality would be some form of psychosis. The developmental metaphor I've already said is plus or minus 4 months from birth. And the primary concern of the baby there is to focus in on the relationship, to connect, and then to find some way of disconnecting. And most of you have seen those fascinating infant films with a mother and a baby watching one another, and the baby will stay with mother for a period of time, and then at some point look away. And our fantasy as the observer is the baby is processing things, trying to make sense of it, and then the baby will look back for more and laugh and so forth, and then at some point the baby will look away again. So we see that in this earliest mode, connecting and disconnecting is a natural ebb and flow of perception of a child. But what we can also say is that during this particular experience, if the child is traumatized in some way or another, the reaching is going to be even more difficult. The metaphor I like to use is with my arm. If I'm reaching and reaching and reaching, trying to find something, and it's not there, then it's only a matter of time before I just give up. No one's there. And if I'm a baby, and if I think that my reaching is where my life depends, I'm going to be frightened. And if I'm reaching, and all of a sudden I get hurt, slapped, hit, screamed at, then there's a different kind of response, not just a withering, but a tight constriction back. And so what we're looking for in psychotherapy, as we look later for the transferences that come from the earliest level of personality formation, the transferences are going to be sort of a weakening, withering, or a sharp constriction. And when are these transferences going to make their appearance? Right at the point when connections are made. And in the cases we're going to look at later in the day, you'll begin to see again and again and again, just when the client and myself begin to move together to where there's some rapport, then there's going to be, something is going to happen. And it's very interesting because each person has their own way of experiencing the terror of connection and moving back from it. So the affects then that are going to be associated with this earliest level of our personality formation are connecting and disconnecting affects. But they often appear inconsistent to an observer. That is, if you're sitting and listening to someone who's functioning, let's say, primarily at this organizing level, they may be going through a story or relating in a certain way, and then suddenly, just as you begin to connect to that, switch or change the topic. Now, I know that you've had that many times in therapy, where you're working with someone and then suddenly they will switch. Well, the fastest way to switch, if you want to, trick the therapist, is to switch to some really juicy bone, like some other memory of some traumatic event in a childhood, okay? Or some deep feeling that's suddenly coming up, or some physical symptom, you're about to throw up or something. So what happens then is that the therapist, wanting to follow along the material, as we're all trained to do so very well, we go leaping with the client into the material where they take us, and what we fail to notice is that there was a connection, that there was intimacy that was forming, and that the person shifted the topic, shifted the personality, shifted us into another whole place so as to disconnect, so as to break the connection. And we'll see this afternoon in some of the cases how people do this. The transference then that we're going to be looking for in psychotherapy is connection versus rupture, discontinuity, and disjunction. That is, how people try to connect and how they move back. We can get in touch with this in ourselves if we just try to imagine the times when we're in let's say, an intimate relationship. It could be with a friend, a lover, it could be with a child, it could be with a client, and you begin to feel the intimacy is, and there's more excitement and there's more interpersonal connection, and then somewhere, for some reason you don't quite know, something inside of you begins to backpedal, begins to shut off, and you find yourself just wanting to pull back or to get out of there, or your mind is blanking, or you're bored, and you're aware that this disconnecting mode is active, pulling you away from the connection. And so what that is a piece of our own developmental history that tells us there's something about this connection that isn't serving my purposes now. There's some reason why I'm frightened of this particular connection. And the reasons generally are primordial, and they have to do with, in connections similar to this, I experienced either nobody being there for me, or I experienced some kind of a traumatic injury in which I had to constrict from. So as we begin to study the reasons that we pull back, that we disconnect emotionally, it's almost always that in some way or another we experience relationships, connection in and of themselves to be frightening or dangerous. So then our resistance to experiencing the transference is to simply connecting. It's better to avoid connections, it's better to stay at a superficial level, an intellectual level, than it is to let intimacy begin to develop. And then our listening mode, as a psychotherapist would be a connecting, intercepting, and linking mode. That is, as we begin, I'll illustrate this later in the day with cases, as we begin to encourage someone who is backing away to stay, we develop a variety of techniques of saying, I know you're frightened, I know there's something going on in your body right now that makes you want to leave the room, makes you want to pull away, but I believe that you can stay with me. And so we find various ways of encouraging people to stay, and as we encourage them to stay, we encourage them then also to experience whatever their psychosomatic reaction is to staying, because it's almost always a body reaction is going to be involved, because at this level, mind and body are so close to the same we can't really meaningfully distinguish them. Wherever it is we begin to distinguish mind and body, it's certainly not at this plus or minus 4 months from birth. They're too intermingled. The therapeutic modality then is that we're going to be focusing on the withdrawal and the destruction of links, and we're going to be working on encouraging people how to connect with us. And then in the countertransfer, well, okay, so all of these we're going to be illustrating with cases, but I wanted to give you the theory, so before we go into the case material, you will see that we're going to be looking for the transference to be the fear or of connecting, the way in which the person disconnects, and then what is the countertrance going to be? And it's going to have something to do with the fear of the intensity of psychotic anxieties that come up from connection. So often what we discover is that when someone is moving towards some area that is frightening to them, we will intuitively pick it up. And so we will be just as frightened as going there as they are. And we may be frightened about when somebody goes into a more primitive place, how are we going to be able to maintain in it? So I'm going to come back and look at these countertransference reactions that we have in a great deal of detail. But at this point, I just wanted to summarize this first listening perspective, which would be the way we would listen to all people presenting any sort of psychotic symptoms for sure. It would be people that we call borderline when they get into more regress modes. It would be any and all people, including ourselves, when we are deep into intimate relationships and we find that there's something in us that's wanting to pull away and to break the connection rather than to sustain it. And the assumption that we're making is that we're going to be able to trace this back to when back in development, pulling back from others was a normal, expectable thing, or pulling back from either people not being there for us or from people shouting, screaming, or hurting us in some way or another, that these are the scars that remain inside of all people, much more pronounced in some people than in others. Let's see. I forgot we have such high tech here that we can go down the points one at a time. So here they go, huh? Maybe next time it'll train me. Do you think these machines train us? Okay. All right, the second listening perspective then is going to be going up the developmental ladder into the period that Margaret Mahler has called symbiosis, 4 to 24 months. The traditional diagnosis then is going to be borderline personality organization, and this would include really all of the character adjustments, character disorders, whatever you want to call them. Many of the eating disorders, most of the addictions are going to fit within this area where there is some sort of a developmental focus or developmental arrest on the symbiotic structuring. Just an example there, for I know a number of you work with various kinds of addictions. You'll find that an utterly fascinating question to put to a client is, when you snort that Coke, where do you go? When you drop that pill, where do you go? When you find yourself shopping mindlessly or staying on the internet for 6 hours at a time, where are you? Where is your mind-body? Where is the place that feels really wonderful? Now, we know that in the traditional approach to addictions, we've generally wanted to think of the addiction as an escape or something bad and so forth, so I don't have any complaint with the traditional approach to it because it's been so effective. But it seems like at some other point we want to try to get inside where the need or the wish or the longing for a particular substance is, and we can look at all of our substance usages, whether it's caffeine or sugar, exercise, internet, whatever it is that we all find ourselves. The question is, what is the state of mind, body that we get into? And as we begin to study that place that we go to, we begin to realize it takes us back to a very deep place inside of ourselves. When Christopher Bolus has looked at it, he's talked about it as an aesthetic moment, a moment in which a baby is being held in its mother's arms in a timeless way. And there's a longing to go back to a place that was just absolutely wonderful. But as maturity has taken us on, we can't get to those places very often. But 6 hours on the internet, you're right back there. How's that? All right? So whatever our addiction is, for me, my own has been caffeine over the years. And it took me a while before I finally realized that my mother came in a cup. That, that my mother was a very high-strung woman, and I think that as a very young child, I learned that so long as I was kind of up like that, I had her. So that whenever I am needy during the course of the day, I can go back to the coffee pot, have a cup of coffee, and my mother is with me in seconds. Right? So this is the way our addictions work. So it's back at this level that we're trying to go back to the place where it once felt wonderful to be, although as we look at symbiosis, we begin to realize it's much more than the bliss. That's the longed for place. But if we look at any mother-baby combination or parent-baby combination between 4 and 24 months, we're going to see not only those nice moments of bliss that the baby longs for and that the mother longs for, we're going to see all sorts of other scenarios. And every mother-baby combination has a different set of scenarios that the two of them engage in. So if you're ever wondering why it is you didn't quite understand what borderline syndrome was, the answer is because nobody knows. Okay? The motivation here is for a baby and a mother to be doing a game, a dance that they know. A dance, a game, an interaction that the two of them have developed together, that only the two of them know, and it's a very special place. And so we always look for that dance. And so we wonder why we're attracted to certain people. It's because there's an emotional dance, an emotional scenario that moves. It's usually pre-verbal. And when we talk about the chemistry that attracts us to certain kind of people, then it's because they're doing this dance right at some deep emotional level. And often when we don't want to be with certain people, it's because they don't do the dance well. So I've told you that the developmental metaphor is 4 to 24 months, and that at that point the affects are the split all good and all bad ambitended affects. That is, if you're doing the game right, if you're doing the dance right, you're good. If you're doing the dance different than what I need, you're not so good. Okay? And the transference then is going to be in the replicated dyadic interactions. That is, to the extent to which then in the psychotherapy situation, the person, by coming in and being a certain way and asking us to be a certain way with them, we find ourselves stretching our boundaries. We find ourselves doing things we don't ordinarily do, and sometimes worrying if we're stepping over bounds in order to be there in certain ways, or if we're really holding the frame properly. But one of the things I used to be aware of, say in a case conference when a therapist would come in, and they would say, well, I'm a little ashamed about presenting this case because I don't usually work this way. And so as the group would begin to listen to the person, we could begin to realize that, no, this wasn't standard technique, but it was the way this particular individual client needed the therapist to be in order to be okay. And so within the bounds of hopefully professional and personal integrity and limits, we stretch ourselves in order to have sort of emotional interactions that are required or asked of us. And it's really only as we allow that interaction mode, that scenario, to become real in the here and now relationship that we can then begin to put words on it and show the person what that mommy and me pattern is and how it works in relationships in the here and now. And we usually have help with that because the people tell us about how I am with my wife, with my husband, with my child, with my boss, with my best friend. There will be memories, of course, that'll go back to the past. But what we're looking for in the transference are dyadic interactions that have a certain flavor and a certain quality and that are present in the transference as well, but that limit the person's life in some systematic way. And it's that limitation that we're always looking for. And here again, what we're aware of in our own selves is that we all have a character structure that exists at this particular level, a pre-verbal level, a pre-conscious level, in which with knee-jerk interactions we just move through the world and select people according to certain dimensions and avoid other people according to certain dimensions, and that what we don't want to do is to take responsibility for that character structure. So the resistance is always to assuming responsibility for being other than the way we automatically want to be. And so when we're in, say, a bonded relationship with someone, it's only a matter of times before two heads bump. I think Harville Hendricks has done such a good job in showing us that by the time any two people get together, they're usually attracted because at some deep level, they're each other's nemesis. That is, at some deep level, we're going to be going for the exact scenario that damaged us as a child, that we established with a mother or another person at that time. We're going to find somebody who will do this game with us, and then of course at some point in time we'll be pointing to them and saying, the trouble with this relationship is you don't do it right. And Harville Hendricks, I believe, has followed psychoanalytic theory very well when he said there is a way out of this, and actually it's a very exciting way, and it's when we find ourselves bumping heads with our partner that we now have the possibility for transformation and growth. That it is through a living through of these deep character scenarios in a loving, caring relationship with someone, a partner, a therapist, a child. Sometimes we relive them with our adult children. That is, that we have learned a scenario and they have learned a scenario when they were very young. And as adults, they want to live it differently with us, or we want to live it differently with our parents. And the question is going to be, can we get out of that old knee-jerk way of interacting that's so familiar at the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas table that we don't want to go to, okay? Can we get out of those ways of interacting and find new ways? The listening mode then is going to be paying attention to the interaction and the replicated scenarios. Since this is 4 to 24 months, there are no words. Okay? The person cannot tell us what the difficulty is in words, because the interaction pattern developed before words did. Now granted, in the second year of life, children are learning to speak, but their speech is about things that are happening to them, not about their being, not about where I'm at, what's going on, about how the interaction is going. That comes later. So that learning relationships happens before speech and before being conscious of relationship happens. So when we're reaching for deep transferences and character reactions, we're going to be reacting, we're going to be reaching for things that are just emotional, automatic interactions. And the therapeutic modality is going to be then watching the replication form in the relationship, watching ourselves stretch to accommodate the other person, finding a way to be together, and then trying to help the person see that I can be here for you in this particular way. It is what you've needed, but it seems like so long as you need to interact this way with me, with your spouse, with your husband, with your boss, you're going to be continuing to limit your possibilities. And so it's a simple thing to say, but it takes months and months to communicate, as you all know. I don't have to tell you that working with lower level characterological transferences takes months just to establish it so that we know what these knee-jerk silent patterns are, and then also a long time to be able to show it to the person and then to find ways of letting go. And it's at that point that we then have suicide fantasies. Can't tell you how many times a therapist has shown up in my office saying, you know, we're in our third year, everything's going well, the person is now relating better than ever, this is happening, we're doing better than ever, and suddenly suicide fantasies appear. My interpretation, the self that you've always known is dying. The self and mother experience that has sustained you for a lifetime is collapsing. So that the suicide fantasies at this point in therapy really are representations of a self-experience that is dying and that's collapsing. And no sooner than that interpretation is made than we have birth dreams and birth fantasies. And we begin to realize that a new sense of being is being born out of letting go of the old characterological ways of relating. In the countertransference here is very different than in any other level. There's going to be a reciprocal mother and infant positions. That is, in this interaction, and I'll show you in the case I'm going to do later this morning, Dora, there's a reciprocal interaction between the client and the therapist, and if the therapist is willing to be fairly flexible and just emotionally present in the best way possible and to let ourselves be sort of molded in a variety of different ways, if we're willing to just be there in that way, we begin to realize that there are certain relationship demands or needs that the person is putting out, and then at some point as we begin to confront those, that's where the interpretation is going to be made. But before that, we're going to find that we don't like being the person's mother. Or if the roles are reversed, we're going to find that we don't like the client mothering us in the way that they were once mothered. So we'll come back and go through what those countertransference reactions are. But as we begin to become engaged in the emotional scenario, we react both to being the child in the interaction and to being the parent in the interaction. So the roles get reversed in this way. Sometimes people say, why do the roles get reversed? The answer is fairly simple. You watch babies reverse roles all the time. That is, mothers and babies are imitating one another. The mother does such and such a thing and waits, and the baby does that same thing back. So that what we begin to realize is that there is a reciprocal role reversal that's automatic, that's a very important part of learning. Call it monkey see, monkey do if you want, but let's hope it's a little more complex than that with human beings. But then there's another reason that has to do with learning mother's position, is because often we feel thwarted, limited, punished, or injured in some way or another by the position that mother has taken or parent has taken. And so in order to try to understand it, we then have to identify with her view. So children very young learn to identify with mother. And once they begin to identify with mother, then they're able to take her role as well. So the primary identification that begins very, very early in life, in some ways, the earliest months of life, allows the role reversal to go back and forth. So in the countertransference, we're also going to expect role reversals. Can we move up the developmental ladder? All right? This is the third year of life. This is the point that Heinz Kohut has talked to us about the self emerging. Now, between level 2, the symbiosis, and level 3, the self, we have what mothers call the terrible twos. Okay? Some people call it individuation, separation. It's the point at which the child says, no, I don't want to be here. I know how you want it. I know this scenario, and I don't want to do it your way. But the terrible twos last, and it's a battle for a certain point, and then once the battle resolved, it's gone, and the child is off to do other things. And so the traditional diagnosis here has been narcissistic personality organization, 24 to 36 months, I said. And the affects here are going to be dependent upon the empathy of the other. Kohut says it in this way, that children need the empathic eye, the gleam in mother's eye, and the pride that father may feel. That's my boy, that's my girl, I'm proud of you. That sense of pride is a healthy thing that allows the self to emerge. Now, this has been happening since the first day of life, when parents address the child as though the child had a self, but slowly a self begins to evolve. And so by the third year, we're aware that the child is now needing affirmation for the self. And so Kohut has talked about it in terms of the grandiose self, the twinning self, and the idealized self. Let's see if I can keep my technology going here. The grandiose self would be then the part that is the see me, nobody's going to rain on my parade, I'm the center of the universe. And Kohut has said how important it is for each parent to be able to just realize that and to go with that flow. And how destructive it is when a child comes running through the door with a big story about what happened outside, and the parent begins to say, you know, put your shirt tail in, and you're dragging mud on the floor, and your hair is not combed, and calling attention to various things, and missing completely the excited self that the child is presenting. And so when people come to psychotherapy, they often want to tell us about some aspect of themselves that they're proud of, that has been achieving something, and how important it is for us to be there, like the affirming parent of the 3-year-old, in order to affirm that nascent sense of self and what that achievement is, and how when we fail, what's going to be relived is a transference. How when we fail, the reactions that we're going to see are going to be similar to the reactions that the child had back at 3 when the parent was not there in an affirming mode. The twinship transference would be the one that we're just alike. We all search for people that are like us. We search for companions that we have things in common with. And so there's a certain likeness that also makes us feel confirmed in our selfhood. And then finally, by idealizing others, we all like to have heroes, political leaders that we respect, teachers who have taught us a great deal. And so in the idealization of another, the emphasis here is I am wonderful because I have wonderful heroes. So this is different from the idealization that Kernberg has taught us at the more borderline level, where the idealization is part of an affective split, the all-good person. This is idealization in the service of strengthening the self, by identifying with other major people that we can respect. The resistance, Kohut has said, to experiencing narcissism in a relationship is shame and embarrassment over our narcissism. So often we may discover the narcissistic transference when we begin to realize that someone is coming in and perhaps telling us about a business meeting, and there was an important presentation, and we feel like somehow there's a very low-key telling us of what happened. As we begin into it, we begin to realize that the person is ashamed to come in and say, I really want to tell you how fabulous I was yesterday, and I want to tell you how well it went. I've been working on it a long time, and I impressed people with it, and I feel like $1 million because I really pulled it off and did well with it. Okay? We all need that. We all need to be able to feel good about ourselves. We all need to be able to tell our important others. Kohut has called them self-object or self-others. We need to be able to tell people about that and to have the kind of affirmation back that lets us know that indeed we are important people on the planet. Kohut says we have narcissistic needs from birth to death, and we need people, self-others, who will help us feel affirmed in who we are from birth to death. And so in the psychotherapy situation, we're often studying people's need to feel affirmed and their fear or their shame of letting the narcissism come out for fear that they will be put down or they'll be thought to be too selfish or too self-centered. Okay? That it's shameful to be narcissistic. Don't toot your horn so loud. Don't break your arm patting yourself on the back. Okay? These are things that we were taught. Well, there's a part of us that needs to pat ourselves on the back and that needs to toot our own horn as loud as we possibly can at various times and have other people applaud. And so in psychotherapy, we need to be able to bring out the need of the 3-year-old and also to bring out the resistance to the shame. The listening mode then that Kohut has taught us is that we engage with the ebb and the flow of the self-experience, that a person needs to present themselves in a way that they're proud of. They need to let us see that they're proud and acknowledge what that's like, and that we need to be able to go with that. The therapeutic modality then, Kohut said, is watching the ebb and flow of the empathy and commenting on it. Okay, here's the example. A person comes in, tells us about something. We said, fine, it sounds like you really did fine at the office, but it goes on. Following session, the person comes in and says, you know, right after a session, last session, I had a splitting headache, and it went on for 3 days. What kind of headache? What happened here? So we go back, and as we retrace it, we begin to realize that what happened was you needed a certain kind of empathy from me, sharing with you the zest and enthusiasm that you had. I didn't provide it for you. You then began to have a reaction to that. Anger, that you couldn't be proud of yourself, anger that I couldn't acknowledge it. And so when we go back, Kohut teaches us, and help the person realize where the empathy failed, and then to restore the sense of self by restoring the failed empathy. Kohut says that boredom, drowsiness, and irritation are the common countertransference we have to narcissism, and I will come back to those in a few minutes. The fourth level, this is the level that of independent relationships. It's the level of psychoneurosis. It's the level that we speak of when we talk about people being well-developed, intact personalities, and yet what we're aware of now is if there ever were neurotics in pure culture, they're not on the planet now. Okay? So that we're aware that neurosis is a developmental achievement. That is, by the time a well-developed child has reached 5 years of age, that there is a certain kind of organization of personality that's possible, but that doesn't eradicate all of the other difficulties that have happened before that. Okay? The developmental metaphor then is the Oedipal period, and what really characterizes this, and really back in 1897 when Freud in his letters first began to talk about the Oedipus triangle, And he talked about it in relationship to Shakespeare's Hamlet, realizing that Shakespeare unconsciously knew about the dilemmas of Oedipus. And what are the dilemmas of Oedipus? Simply that because he was sent away from home at birth, that is rejected early on, that later his both lust and rage began to be directed at both of his parents. And so every person on the planet has had that particular kind of experience. And when we go into the Electra myth, we find that the same sort of unfortunate experience happens to girls, only girls tend to manage it differently. Rather than acting out rage and aggression in war, in wild sexuality, girls tend to develop, as Electra did, frigidity inside, strong inhibitions, and an angry, blaming attitude towards mother, and an impotent attitude towards father. So I think that while Freud originally did not want to use the Electra myth as a counterpart to the Oedipus myth, it was because Freud at that point in time wanted to think of the Oedipus myth as normal. And in time we began to realize there's nothing normal about it. It's just that we realize that all of our sexuality undergoes certain inhibitions at age 5 and 6. And for little boys, the inhibition is such that it gets repressed and then acted out. And for the little girl, more often than not, it tends to get repressed and held in her body in a way that stymies and stifles her. So that these two different myths portray ways in which men and women both experience their sexuality being limited by the problem of triangle relationships. So it's really at this age 5 that a child is able to realize that three-way relationships are very powerful, and the child begins to realize that competition in three-way relationships is very hurtful. I think I want to move on then to the transference, is the experience of the competitive relationship in other relationships, and the countertransference we're going to be looking at, Freud felt was overstimulating. That is, the therapist felt it often in erotic ways or aggressive ways, but that the countertransference was not going to be usable. That is, that we may feel overstimulated in a variety of ways to higher level psychological constellations, but the client, him or herself, is going to be able to tell us about it. Whereas at the earlier developmental levels, the emotional experiences that are salient, the client will not be able to tell us about, and so our countertransference is going to be more important to us. The case of Anna O, and I think we'll take a break right after this, but we've got just a brief thing. Bertha Pappenheim was treated by Joseph Breuer and Freud, and so we're going to go to a little video clip here and tell you about Anna O.
More than 100 years has passed since Bertha Pappenheim invented psychoanalysis. It was she who coined the phrase, the talking cure. Bertha was Dr. Joseph Breuer's, as most of you know. Her analysis lasted 18 months with Freud, when she was later transferred in over 100 years ago, in 1881 and 1882. I always like to tell a story about Bertha because she was a social worker. She later became a celebrated personage. My favorite story is during the Nazi regime. She was running a home for wayward youth, for juvenile delinquents. And at one point, the Gestapo come in with their big black boots and they come banging in and they have this little kid by the ears, you know, and it's, do you know what he's been doing? All over the fences, he's writing, "Fuck the Fuhrer." So she was a tiny little woman, a Jewish lady, and she put her hands on her hips and she told him to get out, that this was a home for disturbed children and they would see that it didn't happen again, and they left. She was recently commemorated on a postage stamp. She was what's been called the specimen case of psychoanalysis. The case in the literature is known as Anna O. When she started, by anybody's standards, we would think her pretty much a basket case. We could use all of our borderline symptoms. You know, there were eating problems and there were addiction problems and there was this, that, and the other. So we'd see her as sort of what, a mixed bag? Borderline, moderate to severe? What would we say? What would the politics of our field want us to do? So Bertha began with Dr. Joseph Breuer, and for long periods of time, he was required to come and see her every day. And then when she'd moved to the country, to her country home in the summers, he'd have to take long train rides out to see her. At times during her analysis, she wouldn't even eat, so he was literally feeding her chicken soup with a spoon. Any of you ever done that? Because she wouldn't eat otherwise. She began first talking about her treatment with Dr. Breuer as waiting all day long until the end of the day when the doctor would come and penetrate her fleecy clouds with his wisdom, with his words. It was like, she said after he left, the chimney sweep had been there. Now, we would miss the sexual metaphors today, and I don't think Dr. Breuer did, nor would we miss today, as I don't think he did, that the onset of Bertha's difficulties were at the point that she began to nurse her father in a terminal illness. And that was the point at which she presented herself for work. The work went on for quite a while, but it became more and more difficult for Dr. Breuer. I know all of you have ideal model people that come to your practices, so you don't have any late phone calls or anything. Well, in those days, of course, there weren't telephones, but there were messengers, and the messengers were ready to run with another message. So at all hours of the day and night, there would be a message come from Bertha's home, and the good doctor would be summoned, and it was getting worse and worse and worse, and he was getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And but what was worse, the relationship began to interfere with his new marriage. Now, I know none of you have ever had marital difficulties over your work. I know that those midnight phone calls are not a problem for your spouses. Well, these messengers, it got worse and worse, and Mrs. Breuer, who was really a new bride, was quite jealous and overcome, and he decided it was time to end this case. Now, I'm sure you've had that happen to you, where it's time to end the case. So he quick-like, through suggestion and command and demand, managed to kind of get Bertha patched together and terminated the case. Well, on the day of termination, needless to say, in the Breuer household, there was going to be a festival like we have today, celebrating something really important. He's rid of that awful Bertha. Okay. There's a special dinner on the table. The candles are lit. You know, they're getting ready for an evening of all of the things that we do with our very significant others after the lights are out. And there's a knock at the door, a messenger from Bertha's family saying all of her symptoms have resurged. It's an emergency. The doctor must come at once. The dinner's put in the oven. Candles are snuffed out for a while. The good doctor puts on his overcoat and goes out into the cold to see Bertha. When he arrives, she goes through, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and doctor, there's something new. Yes, what is it? I'm pregnant, and the baby is yours. This is the beginning of countertransference.
So let's talk about the varieties of countertransference then, and then we'll take a break and come back for a case. At the organizing level, I said that what we're going to have is somebody reaching, reaching, and reaching to us, and then at some point they're going to pull back. And what is that going to stimulate in us? The organizing level is going to stimulate confusion, fragmentation, and withdrawal, and distractibility when the connections are avoided and ruptured. So what we find is that in ourselves, we, in our functioning, become very disrupted in this. And you'll notice in the cases I present this afternoon, the kinds of disruption that the case brought to me. At the symbiotic level, what we're aware of is that we get unusual, untoward, or perverse reactions. Sometimes it's rageful or unbounded responses to the projected scenarios and role reversal scenarios. It's in this particular area the therapists are always struggling with boundary issues. That is, somebody wants me to do this, and I can go this far, but if I go that far, what will this be? And if I do this, and I do that, but if I do this, and so there's all of these various struggles because the person is wanting some kind of an emotional replication. The therapist is trying to be there in a very good way, but it's posing problems for the therapist, and we have all kinds of reactions to those scenarios. And at the self-other level, I've already told you that Kohut said if somebody is presenting narcissism to us repeatedly, then the boredom, drowsiness, and irritation are often the initial feelings, but we can use those feelings as facilitating because we begin to realize, wait a minute, somebody is telling me something They're boring me to death with it because it's a me, me, me kind of thing. But then as you begin to get into, wait a minute, where is this me, me, me coming from, and what is the deficit that this person is telling me about that I may be able to help them with? So that the countertransference reactions can be facilitating. And of course, I've already said that Freud pointed out that in triangular relationships where the competition comes in triangles, we often feel countertransference feelings, but we're not able to use them so well. So what I thought we'd do now is to take about a 15-minute break and come back, and I'll look at the case of Dora, which has some important countertransference experiences. Great. All right. I must beg your forgiveness for the 3 long cases, but I know that you'll understand why. Presenting deep and detailed client material is always risky because of discretion, and also because a certain amount of material one has been given permission to present publicly. So if you stray from your manuscript, you're straying from that which you've been given permission. So I will be staying close to my text when I'm actually presenting clinical material, and I know that you'll understand. The woman I'll speak about, Dora, saw me 2 to 3 times a week for the better part of 2 years in the late 1970s. I always saw Dora as a very gifted woman whose intelligence, creativity, and physical beauty had somehow not been put to good use by her for her own enjoyment, nor harnessed for purposes of self-enrichment and personal growth. Dora's everyday existence in most particulars had come to be remarkably drab, commonplace, and deeply discouraging to her. In our relationship, Dora vacillated from an elated feeling that I could see and appreciate the wonderful person that she hoped she was, to at times an almost delusional suspicion that I viewed her as sick, depressed, ugly, and basically the disgusting person that she believed she really was. Both of us, as bright and articulate people, were able to discuss these concerns in detail and to relate them to current life circumstances as well to many of her growing up experiences. I used the developmental metaphor borderline to describe for myself Dora's chronic and to her depressing ways of relating to people and to her family. The particular thread of our relationship which I wished to follow was what came to be seen by both of us as her sexualized attraction toward me. Held in silence for more than a year, Dora one day with trepidation confessed that she had always had a weakness for blue eyes, especially in the exact combination with brown hair that I have. Several significant men friends have been of the similar coloring and build to myself. I handled her anxious confession with a series of inquiries meant to elucidate associations about why it had taken so long to bring this up with me. What problems was this attraction posing for her? If I were her type, as she said, why couldn't we just simply enjoy that together? I wasn't sure what made this issue so very difficult for her. Was there anything I was doing to make it difficult? Was there anything I could do to make things easier for her? And in our discussions about this, we did have a chance to clarify the fact that our relationship was a professional relationship and with its appropriate boundaries, but she didn't seem to be having trouble with that. Relief followed our discussions, and in subsequent months, a series of expressions emerged. Dora was concerned that she wasn't supposed to be attracted to me, but she just couldn't help it, she said. Yes, at times her attraction had made it difficult to speak with me about certain issues, but if there were ever anything really important, she believed that she had been able to overcome it and to talk to me freely. Dora said she believed me to be a very accepting person, and at the end of what she called good hours, Dora would often sit up a few moments before time to leave and let me know what a pleasure it was to simply look at me and to feel that I was okay with her looking. She would sink into the couch in deep and pleasurable relaxation, drinking me into her eyes and feeling deeply reassured. One day, in the context of telling me about a friend of hers who had just been diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma and explaining to me a new disease among gays, AIDS, Dora confessed a worry that I might be gay. She was afraid that I'd be offended by her saying so and had carefully avoided any mention of the topic. Over the years, she had been close to a number of gay men, she said, and had wondered about the implications of that for herself and for her own sexuality. She had recognized several attractions to women friends in the past, but had never wished to develop the sexual side of these relationships for herself. Perhaps she was projecting her, quote, latent homosexuality onto me, she said. I asked if the thought that I might be gay was reassuring to her. She immediately saw the potentially protective side of her fantasy, saying, well, then I wouldn't have to be concerned about my attraction toward you. But she hoped that I weren't gay because her recently diagnosed friend has been miserable for years, searching bathhouses and bars every night, going through one disastrous relationship after another. She hoped that whatever my personal circumstances were, that I wasn't miserable and that I was safe from agony, disease, and death. Dora spoke of potential abandonment and her fear of being left alone. She concluded by reassuring either herself or me or both of us that there was really no need to worry, since she was sure that I wasn't gay and that I wasn't in danger of dying. I must be a really good fuck, she said, the kind that she had always wanted for herself. Okay. Now, many will feel critical of my technique upon hearing how, throughout this time period, I handled the numerous demands for reassurance which came up frequently with Dora. Did I think highly of her? I did. Could I see her artistic creativity in the productions she brought me? I could. Did I find her an attractive person? Yes, I did. And so on. I had early on attempted the usual set of inquiries about what brought these concerns up at this particular moment in time. Was her question possibly related to other things she'd been talking about or thinking about? My inquiries, however, not only failed to elicit associations, but regularly increased her agitation, which, when I followed it up, resulted either in deep feelings of worthlessness because I probably really didn't like her at all, or at best in feelings of rage directed at me for playing a cat and mouse game with her. After all, she believed she had a reasonable right to know what I thought of her. Even if she granted me the privacy of the specifics, couldn't I at least acknowledge feelings and thoughts that we both knew about anyway, she said. In response to my suggestion on my part that answers to her questions would reassure her, and therefore that the anxiety around those questions and her depression and her anger which she might feel would go overlooked by both of us, she responded, bullshit, bullshit, and more bullshit. There's no reason why we can't be honest here. After all, you all are supposed to be completely analyzed, aren't you, she says. In some profound sense, Dora seemed to be right. And when I felt freer in my expressions toward her, our work went much more smoothly. But for some reason, I was not happy with having so frequently to serve for her a reassuring function. On several occasions, she came to stare at my arms and my chest with delightful squeals. She declared she'd always been a chest woman, and that my general build, specifically my chest, and the little black hairs which occasionally peeped out from my open shirt just drove her crazy. Well, in reviewing my feelings on the matter, it's clear that in many ways I did enjoy her sexual attraction to me. However, I became aware of my self-consciousness, and that I caught myself occasionally in the morning sorting through which shirt or pants I might be wearing on a day that I was going to be seeing her. All attempts to make any analytic headway on these developments in our relationship, however, resulted in a bland response from her. Dora, however, gradually replaced most of her wardrobe and began paying attention to small details in her makeup and her hair. Her current sexual relationship improved considerably. She discussed this jubilantly as her progress at getting out of her drab, weepy, homey self. Those are her words. She was enjoying making the best of what she had. She attributed the changes to new freedoms that she was developing as a result of her therapy, which I believe in most ways was true. Dora was able to say that seeing herself through my eyes made her feel alive to the fine person that she is and to the ways that she might come to enjoy herself and others in the world in general. There were similar evidences of increased self-esteem in a variety of social and occupational changes that she made. Her improvement was in fact dramatic, in retrospect perhaps a sign of the developing problem. Looking back, what was perhaps never made fully explicit was how much the improvements in self-esteem and related activities may have been dependent upon my real or fantasied estimate of her. For reasons of discretion, I'm specifically avoiding mentioning the main lines of content of her analysis that reached into her past, pervaded her present, and gave her reason to suppose that her future would be no better than the past had been. The themes frequently did appear in the transference replication and did yield to interpretive work. We both felt basically good about the analysis, and others near her experienced a considerable easing of her tensions. A temper tantrum or terrible twos quality, which she herself called bitchiness, would occasionally appear, which we could relate to her relationship with her mother. Later, in grasping at straws to understand what was going wrong, I was able to formulate in detail for consultation with colleagues a set of interactions or scenarios that I had been considering. The dyadic interaction patterns or scenarios which I did formulate, I still believe to be accurate descriptions derived from her early interaction with her mother. But no amount of analytic work or no amount of work on the symbiotic and separating, replicating scenarios was able to avert the impasse that finally developed between us. We both saw and could talk about her behaving towards me as she had towards her mother. And in her final actions towards me, we could even discuss her behaving as her mother had behaved towards her. The usual regressions and resurgence of symptoms occurred prior to weekends and holiday breaks, and I might add that Kohut-styled interpretations of self-object functions of empathic failure seldom seemed to help her. On the other hand, Dora took readily to developmental metaphors. One day she saw lying on my desk a copy of Louise Kaplan's Oneness and Separateness. I don't know how many of you know that, but Louise Kaplan was one of Margaret Mahler's researchers. And the Oneness and Separateness book, which is available at your bookstores, is quite a good book on early development for us, but also for, I would say, sophisticated clients, clients that read well. It's a very readable book. Oneness and Separateness, Louise Kaplan. She asked to borrow it, and she derived a lot of mileage in terms of understanding her own ambidextrous relationship with her mother and the mood swings which she was prone to experience herself. Another time, just before a holiday, Dora brought a lovely black pebble which she had found on a beach and had taken to have polished for me. It sits to this day in an antique inkwell, my grandfather's, on my desk. I occasionally pick it up and think fondly of Dora. The seeds of the trauma which eventually resulted in Dora breaking off our relationship began one day about midway through the 2-year period of analysis. She had begun enjoying her newfound capacity to tell me about her attraction towards me and to just sit quietly on the couch for periods before and after our sessions, just enjoying listening to me talk and watching me. I know that I felt squirmy when she would do this, but at some level I also enjoyed being looked at and being joyed in the deep and satisfying way that she took me in. I was glad to be there for her. I was pleased that Dora liked our interaction and derived a great deal of pleasure from it, because there were so few pleasures in her life at that particular point in time. But one day, in what way I don't know, she caught my discomfort. It was as though I was trying hard to be there for her in the way that I was sure she wanted me to be, and yet I was on guard about letting my uneasiness show. But my guard must have been momentarily down, and she caught me flinch or avert my gaze in some way or another. Nothing was said at the time. I had been painfully aware for some time of my growing dislike of what seemed to me to be her parading her erotic attachment in front of me, and my wish to escape her gaze, her intensity, her sense of intrusion, which stimulation provided by this very attractive woman was provoking in me. The following session, Dora came in bedraggled, wearing old clothes, sweats, no makeup. She wordlessly lay down on the couch, and I waited a long time until quiet, deep sobbing began. Dora had frequently cried bitterly, but this seemed somehow different, much deeper and much worse. Not until she began talking was I aware that she had detected my discomfort the previous hour. She had concluded that our whole relationship had been a giant fraud, just as she had vaguely suspected all the way along. I didn't really like her. It was a therapeutic trick, make the patient feel better so they keep coming. She had been wasting her time. She had hoped that after all these years of never being recognized and not being responded to, that at last she had found someone who could like her and who could be her friend. It was more withdrawal and hurt today than anger. I sensed no quality of manipulation or even of hope, rather a total collapse of all that had been experienced as good and a very deep sense of despair and rage. I've often wished that I could recall exactly my responses during that hour, but it passed so quickly and I was struggling hard to stay afloat, so that I'm not even sure I could have recalled the details sufficiently to make notes. I was basically able to empathize with how perfectly terrible she must feel, and I was even able to add a few specifics from my understanding of her that portrayed her devastation even more vividly and related it to past devastations and past losses. But my empathy, while acknowledged and appreciated by her, could not, as she said, put Humpty Dumpty together again. It seemed clear to me that I must try to acknowledge somehow the truth of what Dora saw. So often in her childhood, her correct perceptions had been invalidated by adult opinion. Somewhat reluctantly, I confirmed that I had in fact become uncomfortable with her admirations of myself and my body, and I was not quite sure yet exactly what I was feeling. However, I told her as nearly as I could tell, she was wrong in her interpretation that I hated her, that I was perpetuating some kind of an analytic hoax, and that it was all an act, presumably for her own good. Hoping to save the scene and to ease her out of her dreadfully painful state, I told Dora that she should not hold herself responsible for my reactions to her admirations. I disclosed that my emerging feelings of discomfort seemed more like they related to interfering features from my own past and not personally in any way to her way of relating to me in the present. In fact, while I had not mentioned it to her, I had been occupied for some time attempting, as a result of my uneasiness, to dredge out some experiences from my own adolescent and pre-adolescent period, when for a protracted period of time I had felt subjected to similar erotic, intrusive staring and parading of an erotic attachment, which had produced similar feelings of overstimulation and easiness with me at that time in my life. When Dora registered astonishment and disbelief at my taking personal responsibility for my flinching, I very briefly disclosed some of the nature of my previous experience. I didn't think I wanted to do more than just try to say, there's something there, it belongs to my past, I don't think it belongs to you, I'm sorry it's coming up. Okay? The disclosure and the apology that it was coming up were authentic, and she sensed that. And it did serve to pull her out of her disastrous state that she had fallen into. I took my countertransference reactions then and her material to a peer consultation group to discuss it with, and I was enabled from consultation to come up with some more understanding of where it had been in my past, why I was disturbed by it, but I wasn't able to get too much further with how it might be affecting her work. Summarizing the after effects of this incident, I will say first that our work resumed its regular pace after a few halting sessions. Dora did, however, refrain from, quote, overwhelming me again by staring or making it a point of enjoying me too much. My various inquiries into why she felt to alter her spontaneity to protect me were met with responses somewhere in between, on the one hand, an understanding and a respect for an area that was sensitive to me personally, and on the other hand, a mild sarcasm that meant she must not express to me her true self and risk offending or upsetting me or my abandoning her. So she kind of went back and forth. When I challenged this, Dora would acknowledge that she didn't really think that I was all that fragile, but she did like me a lot, and part of what she had been working on with everyone as a result of her therapy was becoming a better person to people, a trend which was genuinely working for her in many areas of her life, and she was having very good experiences with it. But I remained unconvinced of this explanation of the alteration in our relationship, and from time to time I told her so. The flinching incident came up in a variety of ways over the next year, and it was put to good use by us on a number of occasions for one reason or another. The final blow took me entirely by surprise. For a full year after the flinch, Dora had been preparing for an advanced examination relating to her career. She'd been taking classes, studying, working through trial exams and review seminars. Her preparations were loaded with anxiety and also forward-looking with hope and creative prospects. She was really coming to life and really feeling good about where she was going and preparing for this exam. She was doing much better than the people that she'd been studying with, and much better than people with far more experience than herself. She was a very bright woman, and so in all of the trial exams she could tell that she was doing very well. The exam came, and she felt that she had passed, and she'd pleased that she had maintained well. She budgeted her time efficiently, and she completed the test with reasonable time for review and a good sense of security. Several weeks later came the day of triumph, and an on-top-of-the-world sense of glee. A tenth of champagne she brought and 2 champagne glasses for us to celebrate her having attained the highest possible percentile score in this professional exam. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, so I managed to beg off of the champagne with a few celebration sips, all right? She was in her glory. We celebrated all of her successes over the last 2 years and the immense prospects for her future career and the new placement which the exam had made possible. As in most such champagne reviews, we were discussing sort of the before and the after picture, jointly taking credit for the big step forward into the new, never before dreamed of sense of success and independence. During our review, Dora asked me to say how I viewed our work together. Trying as much as possible, as is my custom, to stay with the metaphors provided by the client, okay, I said, when we began, you were so invested in seeing yourself as weepy, drab, and homely. Now we've proved all that wrong. At first, Dora seemed pleased with my assessment. But after a few minutes, her whole affect suddenly changed to enraged grief, and our celebration came to a screeching halt. The truth had finally come out. All along, I'd seen her as weepy, drab, homely person, and now she'd heard it with her own ears. She knew it was true. I'd even tried to lie my way out of it, saying that my flinch was personal and unrelated to my feelings about her. She would never be able to trust me again. She screamed at me with huge tears running down her face, and at last stormed out. To say I was speechless wouldn't quite be correct, but nothing I could say seemed to help. Dora was adamant that she had not misunderstood me, that I simply had finally confirmed what she all along had known. She called and left a message canceling all future appointments. However, she consented after a few weeks to come in and see me several times again. It was very clear to both of us that our therapy was over, and no effort on my part to turn the tide was of any use. She did, at my request, consult with a woman therapist whom I had suggested. And during these sessions with this consultant, the consultant reported back to me there was a constant, desperate plea by Dora to be able to return to me, to see me again, and to restore our relationship, but a firm refusal to do so because her trust had been so entirely shaken. No other possibilities could be entertained. I telephoned her later at several long intervals. Dora always seemed pleased to hear from me, but she saw no point in our continuing together. I was a good person who had helped her greatly, and she very much appreciated that, but there was no way for her to continue. Her new career work was exciting and going extremely well. She felt better than ever about most aspects of her life and relationships, except the loss of her analysis. Her comments at this point seemed free of accusation, manipulation, or guilt induction. By the second call, when I called her, she had read August, and she had started seeing a woman who could relate to her warmly, like she felt the analyst in August had done. I found myself soundly defeated. I'd taken a number of opportunities to consult on my work with colleagues, but was ultimately dismayed, and I must say, mildly disenchanted and disgusted when she told me that she had found the kind of warm, accepting therapist that she was looking for. I was not personally acquainted with her new therapist, but I had given her several names of people that I did know to be good that she did not choose to go to, so somehow I doubted that she would finally get now the help and the therapy that she needed and that she deserved. There are many places at which the discussion of such an unhappy story might begin. Those versed in separation individuation themes in therapy with borderlines will be quick to point out the loss of the symbiotic at oneness which the jubilant ascension into independent selfhood may have precipitated. That is, that there was a certain way of being with me, and once she got to the point of being independent, we were both celebrating it, that the abandonment depression came in. Or the enraged grief might be considered an attempt to restore the stormy symbiotic mode of relatedness that she was losing as a result of her analytic work. That is, when we talked about borderline scenarios, we can say that there's a need for the scenario to keep going, and that there is a loss of the scenario, a loss of the mother bond, when the stormy quality begins to leave. But I can assure people that are going on those lines that these themes had been present all along in the therapy, and I believe for the most part that we did attend to them. All attempts to interpret along lines those lines were refused at the time, and I might add, refused by a very bright woman who did not want her analysis destroyed. The concept of transference rupture, which we now use with organizing transference, was not a working tool back in those days, so we couldn't have gone that way. The content of the opposition scenarios, which I've mentioned, but I've omitted the discussion of, could also be looked to for explanation. Potentially questionable areas regarding my technique, such as reassurances, gratifications, mutual expressions of interest, breaking the frame by allowing sexual looking and champagne, those might all have a definite, but I believe minor place in any systematic attempt to reconsider the work. As in any piece of depth analysis, there's many places where issues of technique might be fruitfully raised, but what element theme might be in order to help us the most? Let's see. I can now see ever so clearly that Dora was right, and that in essence I had been living a lie with her all along, and that she knew it and I did not. Furthermore, I now believe that she was right in stopping the therapy. She could sense that I had not and could not at the time have spotted the problem that she was presenting, as sincere as she knew I was in trying to understand her. And what was the lie that I was living? The lie was when I told her I did not dislike her for intruding, and that I did not loathe the way that she stared at me and spoke of my sexual appeal to her. That I did not hate her for the way she made me be on guard every minute and not let me see how uneasy, how vulnerable, how frightened she was making me feel. Instead, I felt forced to reassure her of what a fine person she was, how much I liked her, how her intrusions were no bother to me. True, my disclosure hit the mark in telling her the genetic history of where I was uncomfortable, but it carelessly sidestepped what she needed me to see. What she needed me to see was that we had succeeded in our relationship in replicating the traumatic circumstances of her childhood. I had fallen into a position always occupied by her in relation to her fragile, vulnerable, and demanding mother, who watched her every move like a vulture, measuring her own self-esteem and fullness by the child's good, false self-conformity. Dora had always portrayed her mother as a horrible person, but we can now ask, was her mother as horrible or intrusive or vicious as she maintained? From one standpoint, yes, her mother did foster the development of this dreadful way of responding and relating, but from another standpoint, no. Her mother's own frightened, fragile personality always stood in danger of collapsing in rage and despair if her daughter's responsiveness was not approving, apologetic, self-effacing, and in many ways on guard and conforming to the mother's relatedness demands. So you can see how the role reversed. And she was doing to me what had always been done to her, and I was not able to see it, and by specifically avoiding it, taking responsibility for it, I was missing her material. This sensitive child, out of a deep sense of attachment to her mother and a thorough knowledge of her mother's vulnerabilities, systematically warped her personality to support her mother's perpetually fragmenting self-states and precarious confusions. Dora was doing to me what had been done to her, that is, forcing me to mold to her intrusive needs, and at some level, she knew it. I had not yet understood her communication, though the replicated interactions, and when they were confronted, I basically lied, as she had always done. I was not fully aware of the nature of the lie I was perpetuating until much later. Freud spoke of the tendency in human development to turn passive trauma into active mastery. Anna Freud formulated this kind of phenomenon in terms of identification with the aggressor, the role reversal. Melanie Klein spoke of projective identification. Otto Kernberg speaks of alternating self and object representations being projected into the analyst. All of these ideas point towards a general set of experiences and analytic work in which the analyst comes to experience the relationship in much the same way that the client once experienced basic attachment and separation relatedness in childhood. That is, in the symbiotic or borderline scenarios, we find that we are not only asked to be the parent, the good parent and the bad parent, but at a deeper level, the roles are reversed, and we are parented in the way that our client was once parented. And in not understanding that, I could not show her that, and help her see it. At a paraverbal and nonverbal level, Dora knew the self-sacrifice she had made in order to be with her mother all those years. She tried her very best in a most creative way to show me her life story, to show it to me by doing it to me, by engaging and involving me in her relatedness patterns. Her creativity had found a way of replicating her truth in our relationship. She was hoping that I would find some way of reverberating with her inner experience and ultimately of reflecting her truth to her at a higher level of representation, that is, through words and symbols that would have the power to transform her in her adult life. But I failed her. I flinched. The flinch wasn't so bad in itself. In fact, flinching was very much to the point of her material, indicating my personality's responsiveness to her lifelong position with her mother and later with everybody else. My attempts to acknowledge responsibility for my personal contribution to our interaction, that is, my disclosure per se, wasn't necessarily faulty either. Dora had found an ingenious way to use my personal sensitivities to replicate the flinch and thereby to register accurately the central problem for which she had sought analysis. Dora had found a way of stimulating my hatred for her for what she was doing to me, but I had found no way to experience or to show her my hatred, and then to show her how now I could understand the treacherous nightmare that she had lived in relation to her mother her entire life. I was not successful in articulating to Dora how my position vis-a-vis her was stunting me, was strangling out whole areas of my spontaneous, creative personality functioning, and forcing me into unnatural and guarded responsiveness. When I failed to find a way to acknowledge that in certain ways I had indeed experienced Dora as the weepy, drab person she projected that she was, and when I failed to understand and admit just how she had succeeded in stunting my personality, in alienating me, and arousing my hatred towards her, she then realized that I could not help her further. I had let her down with no indication whatsoever that I could or would be able to do better in the future. So there's a lot of ways we could discuss this. Let me mention a few that have come to mind. The first one comes from Christopher Bolus, and I've gotten to where I call it the Bolus twist. Do you like that, the way it disappears? Christopher Bolus, who, by the way, is a native son of California, grew up in Laguna Beach before he went to Smith School of Social Work and then the London Psychoanalytic Institute to train. So he married a British woman and has English children, lives in London but comes back and forth to New York and Southern California. So occasionally, if a Kit is in town, it's very important for you to go and hear him. He, in his paper, 1983 paper, Expressive Uses of the Countertransference, it was that paper that allowed me to see my mistake in this particular case. I call it the Bolus twist because what we have to do is to twist around or to turn around the self and object, the role reversals. And so there's several different ways in trying to interpret in this role reversal. Here's some of the suggestions that we might use. The first one then is that nonverbal action or emotion interpretations are probably the best way. That is, this material is not early on in therapy at a verbal level, so it can't be spoken. It's the way that we are with people that allows the replication to go and then allows us to stand against it. So in this particular case, there might have been a number of ways in which I could have taken up verbally and non-verbally the discomfort, how she was creating the discomfort, what the purpose of the discomfort was. Okay? Some of them might have used words, some of them might have been non-verbal, but some of them might have just been in the way that I, in some way or another, showed her that on the one hand, while I very much appreciated, her liking me, that there was some discomfort that was stirred up in me, or that when I found her liking me so much, I found myself limited in certain ways. The second suggestion here is that we cultivate a casual and collaborative attitude. That is, when we try to interpret the countertransference, we're speaking for the child's self. So when Bolas says, how do we do this, his first response is very carefully. Okay? That is, to be able to kind of scratch the back of our head and say, you know how sometimes when you come here with things to tell me, you maybe have a dream or a weekend episode, and you're not quite sure what it means, but you know it's important? Well, you know, there's sometimes when I have these thoughts or flashes or feelings that I believe is related to our work, but I don't know how it's related, or I don't know what it's for exactly, and I need to be able to sort of throw something out here, throw a feeling out, just to be able to discuss it and see where it goes. So that just as you bring half-baked things in, we don't understand them very well until we talk about them, I need to be able to bring in half-baked ideas and let us throw them around until we can talk about them. So by giving ourselves, creating an atmosphere in which we can speak a little more freely, sort of talk about feelings that we're having without sort of knowing where they're going, then that might have allowed me, say, in this particular instance, the opportunity to begin expressing some of the discomfort, expressing some of the difficulties that I was having.
What was your theoretical orientation about countertransference at that time?
Very good question. My theoretical orientation at that point in time was that countertransference was bad.
So you were very classical. So
I was classically trained.
It was not your problem, it was her problem.
Exactly. And so I did go far enough to be able to say that I knew I was having the reactions. I felt the reactions were related to me, not to her. I was sorry my reactions were interfering with her work, which is the classical position.
And so there's no way you could...
There's no way I could have ever gotten to her material. Exactly. Thank you for that question. That's a good one. So then we're also addressing two different levels here. That is, on the one hand, we need to be able to say, you know, our relationship is going very well. We're doing wonderful. You're coming in here. You're just sort of opening up, saying what's on your mind, doing what. But I also need to be able to have my own reactions to it. So on one level, the analysis is going great. Our relationship is going great. But at some other level, I'm starting to have some feelings of discomfort. I'm starting to be aware that when you come in here looking at me in this way, or wanting to stare at me, or feel sexual things, I'm feeling a bit of discomfort about that, and I don't know quite what it's about. Now, where we're going with this, hopefully, is by being a bit suggestive, speaking some of the countertransference in a way that hopefully can be tolerated and is tactful in that way, that we can then call upon our client to fill in the details of it. Because although this material is filtered, I'm feeling it, it's filtered through the experience of my adolescence, and later on I even realized that it went way back to an early interaction with my mother about being penetrated in a certain way and being seen in a certain way. And so when I was being penetrated in the scene here, it was making me nervous. So the real level is things are going great. Your job is to come and let it all hang out. You're doing it. I'm doing my best to understand it. Everything's going fine. But at the level of feelings, it seems like you're stirring up some feelings in me of either not liking this, not liking you, objecting to this or objecting to that. So we're talking in two levels at once, so that it's not, I am coming to hate you. So you're out of that realistic element, because the reality is everything's fine, but we're here to explore feelings. And it seems like sometimes I have some feelings that belong to something in your past that we need to explore. So it's that sort of mode. I talk about two rules of thumb for the interpretation, and sometimes these seem a little bit confusing. I say when you don't know if it's a higher level constellation or transference you're going for, or lower level one, then we need to go for the lower level first. That would be the symbiotic. That is the mommy and me sort of level. And the reason is because if we go for that lower level first, and it's mommy and me, but it's more complex, the client will be able to correct us very quickly and let us know that, no, it's not that at all, it's something else. But if we go for a higher level verbal interpretation or of something, a triangular situation, perhaps there was something between your mother and your brother and your father and so forth and so on, then the client has no way of saying, no, there's something deeper, because the client has projected feelings into me. It's as though I'm in possession of large portions of the material, and if I don't speak them at this lower level, they will never be spoken. And Christopher Bolas's question is, since so much of this material is nonverbal, the client cannot tell us why he or she is there, so who's going to speak it? And the answer is there's only two people in the room. Okay? And so it is we who have to speak those things that can't be spoken. So at the level of the content, that is this more of a triangular, a competitive thing, or a narcissistic issue, or more a mommy and me kind of level issue, we go for the lower level, developmental level first, allowing that the client can correct us if we're wrong, but if we go for the higher level, the client cannot correct us. When we're having talk about form, though, whether we're going to go verbal or nonverbal, then I think it's always good to go for the verbal, the higher level first. That is, the patient may well have the capacity to put this into words. So we try with words at first, and then if words are not there, we go a little more for the interactional in terms of showing the person that I'm having a hard time with this or whatever else is going on. 3 common countertransference errors that I find that therapists are all the time engaging in. One is ignoring troublesome countertransference feelings. That is, it's easiest to just keep on moving with whatever the content is and to ignore that we're having these feelings. And I believe that's an error because the feelings often contain very valuable pieces of information. The second one is that we try to be objective, either with some theory or some way of working or some sort of scientific notion about what people are about or what therapy is about or what a true narcissist is or a true borderline is. So we go into trying to be objective or theoretical about it. And the third error, I think, then, is the one that I made here, which is taking responsibility for the countertransference myself. That is, I clearly knew where my flinch came from. And later, there were deeper levels of where it came from that I didn't quite know that it came from. So it was all filtered through that, but she used my personality in order to do it. And so when we think about the sexual transference and countertransference dimension, there's many different ways that we try to think about what sexuality can mean. One of the most common ones is that we find that there is a fusion or confusion between sexual responses and affectionate responses. And so often, if people had certain sorts of interactions back at the early childhood level, but by the time puberty has passed, those same kind of interactions get sexualized. So by the time there is a sexual dimension in the transfers or the countertransference, it seems as though it's sexual, but it's not about anything that's sexual. That is, sexual coloring has been put on top of a need for love, a need for affection, a need for a certain kind of interaction. So when we talk about erotic transference and erotic countertransference, more often than not, we're going to find that it comes from a confusion of affection and sexuality. But here, the interesting thing to me, or the most interesting thing, is I believe that the sexualization of the transference was a function of the countertransference. That is, I don't have any reason from anything I know about her to believe that there was any boundary violations sexually, any molestation in her childhood of any sort or not. True, she had a brother that loved to make off-color remarks in public that embarrassed her, but they weren't violations. So I don't believe that there was any history of sexual intrusion. She found where I flinched. The flinch was the important thing because that was hers. She discovered, and I don't have to tell you because you've all had clients who discover your Achilles heel. They find where you're going to flinch, where you're going to get angry, where you're going to get impatient, where you're going to get bored, and whatever they need to show you, they will find that piece in your personality and work it. Okay? And work it to good effect because they will show you something by working it. Here she found where I would sit there conflicted saying how nice this is, lying through my teeth when I didn't like it, until finally she caught the flinch and she caught me in a lie and she realized that she had put me, you see, where she always was as a child. So in this case, I don't think that the erotic transference had anything to do with her. I think it had to do with me. She found where she could make me uncomfortable. And by that then gave her the place for the role reversal. Have I said that clearly? Is that everyone get? Yeah. It's kind of a surprising twist, isn't it? And then, of course, this case is particularly illuminating because sexuality in psychotherapy gives us all trouble in one way or another. It comes up all the time, either in transference dimension or the countertransference dimension. It's something we have a hard time talking about. But it's about as far as our field has gotten in talking about it so far, is to realize the confusion of sexuality and affection that's often there. But I don't think that we've begun to realize how often a sexual countertransference could be sexual transference could be a function of the countertransference. That is, we all have sexual histories that are checkered in one way and another, whether they've had any overt violations or molestations of one sort or another or not. They may have, they may not have, but nonetheless, everyone has had difficulty growing up in an environment, in a culture, in a society that devalues sex, that promotes it all the time, that stimulates our sexuality, and then yet tells us that we cannot express it in a whole variety of ways. So all of us have grown up with a variety of sexual issues, sexual repressions, sexual longings, and yet, since we've been taught that they don't belong in psychotherapy, then we do our best to leave them out of psychotherapy, but all of our clients bring their issues. So here we have two highly sexually charged beings in a room, both people pretending as though sex doesn't exist. No wonder we're in trouble. Okay? So somehow it seems like one of the items on the horizon for all of us is to begin studying sexual transference and sexual countertransference a little more forthrightly. And Virginia Hilton has recently contributed a paper, Sexuality in Psychotherapy. It's printed in our book, Therapists at Risk, and it's her extensive study of not only the sexual responses of therapists. So she's got a lot of literature in there, and then she also has a lot of ideas about how our training might have been improved on, and how those of you who are involved in training psychotherapists might begin involving younger people in terms of helping them realize and define their own sexuality, their own history with it, difficulties they have in it, and how that sexuality is bound to come up and to be a factor in psychotherapy. Well, I would like now to ask you all to do, remember we talked about the different kinds of countertransference. We talked about to highly structured levels being an impediment. We talked to about the narcissistic levels being the boredom and drowsiness could be facilitated in terms of tuning us into narcissism. But at this level of the borderline, what I'd like to do now is to ask you all to just experiment with me a little bit and try a little exercise in feeling. So if we do this, you've got to put down your pens and paper and get in a real comfortable seat. We're going to do a visualization to see if we can, if I can show you how in your own mind, body, and practice, how the tool that I did not have available to me when I was working with Dora, how perhaps we can put it to work for all of us. So if you would, close your eyes and allow yourself to think about some client that you're having an enormous amount of difficulty with right now. Some countertransfer, it doesn't have to be now, it could be in the past. The best one is a client that you're struggling with now. It could be a personal relationship, but clients are better. And try to bring that person up in your mind's eye. Do a close-up view of their face. Listen to his or her voice. Bring the way this person laughs into your consciousness. Then watch the person walk around a little bit. Notice how their body moves. Notice the kind of feelings that you have towards this person. Kind of bring this person to alive in your consciousness. And I'm going to ask you some questions, some incomplete questions that I'd like for you to fill in the blanks. The first one is, when I'm with you, I feel. Say in your mind how you feel when you're with this person. You make me want to just, when I'm with you. The thing that I fear most about our relationship is the trouble with you is the best part of our relationship is I feel most positive about you when I could feel safe and comfortable and warm with you if only you. I feel most manipulated by you when. I feel most mistreated by you when. We could really get somewhere if only we could. Okay, and now I'd like for you to look up, and without thinking about it, I just want to hear some of the responses that you got. What were you saying to this person?
I would feel better if you would listen and do what I'm thinking I want you to do.
If you just listen and do what I'm thinking you'd like me to do. Yes, what did you come up with? Same thing?
Fear.
Fear. I'm frightened by you, okay?
Yeah, if you quit making me feel like I need to be responsible for you.
Quit making me feel like I need to be responsible for you. That's good.
If you quit throwing your money in my face.
Quit throwing your money in my face.
Stop giving me the suicidal feelings.
Stop giving me
The session.
Stop having suicidal feelings at the end of the session. All right?
I have no feelings. I'm pushing her away.
I'm pushing her away. No feelings.
I'm pushing her away.
Okay. Did you have something?
If you weren't so big.
If you weren't so big. What about back here?
If you tell me what you need from me.
Tell me what you need from me.
You make me feel like I should tell you a right answer.
All right.
It's going to be so endless. It's never going to end.
It's never going to end. It's going to go on forever and ever and ever. What did you come up with?
Stop telling me that I'm the only person that can help you.
Stop telling me
That I'm the only person that can help you.
that I'm the only person that can help you. Okay.
Judgmental. Stop being so judgmental.
Stop being so judgmental. Okay.
Honesty. Honesty.
Be honest. Okay.
I'd say variable responses. Respond and then not respond.
Respond and not respond.
Vulnerable.
Vulnerable. You make me feel vulnerable. All right.
Stop being so passive.
Stop being so passive. All right. What about over here?
Grow up.
Just grow up.
I'm afraid of your anger.
I'm afraid of your anger.
Stop being so hateful.
Stop being so hateful.
Please don't manipulate me.
Please don't manipulate me.
Stop being so superficial.
Stop being so superficial.
I feel so defensive and vulnerable.
I feel so defensive and vulnerable. And what about you?
I'm in competition with you. You emote too much. You talk too much.
You talk too much. I'm in competition with you. What about here?
I like to strangle.
I like to strangle you. All right.
Mother, get out of my life.
Mother, get out of my life. I got that.
So the adolescent, if only your parents would change.
If only your parents would change.
Stop expecting so much from other people.
Stop expecting so much from other people.
Stop being so sexually macho and get real.
Stop being so sexually macho and get real. Okay. All right. Now, close your eyes again. You're getting younger. You're getting younger and younger and younger. You're now a teenager. You're 14. You're 13, 12. You're 8 years old. Your body is getting smaller. Your mind is getting smaller. You're 6 years old, 5, 4, 3. You're 2 years old now, and you're getting younger. You're 1 year old. You're 12 months old now. And you're in your crib. You're standing up, and you're holding on to the bars. And you're looking at this client that you just spoke about, who is now your mother. What do you want to tell your mother? Now let me hear from you.
Get away from me.
Get away from me?
Block.
Don't leave me? Don't leave me?
Pick me up.
Pick me up?
Be more present.
Be more present? Listen to me.
It was my father.
It was my father. Okay, all right.
Like, don't hurt me.
Don't hurt me. All right. How about back there? Pay attention to me? Someone else? How about? Too distant. You're too distant. How about over here?
Don't okay.
I'm okay?
Don't need me so much.
Don't need me so much?
Show me your anger and frustration.
Show me your anger and frustration.
I'm in deep.
I'm in deep? Okay.
Don't be sick, Mom.
Don't be sick, Mommy.
Hold me and love me.
Hold me and love me.
You're absorbing me.
Absorbing me?
Don't expect so much.
All right, now, in order to interpret the countertransference, you have to go in next week and say what you just said to me to your client.
Okay.
Are you following my link? Are you following what I did? I'm presuming that you chose somebody that you were in pretty much of a struggle with, so therefore there's somewhat of a relationship going, so that something of this other deeper half has been projected into you. Right? By the time you let yourself regress and reverse roles, you could begin to say you've got a message for your client, but this last message is actually your client speaking to his or her mother. That's the way this works. So now I'm going to tell you how to do it, if I can find the right slide. There we go. You have it in your handouts. Interpreting the countertransference. Did everyone follow the shift? Okay. All right. The first thing in terms of how to interpret the countertransference is this particular use of countertransference, we're talking about focusing on the symbiotic character structure. That is, a person that you know well, you're looking at their character structure, you're involved with them, you've got a relationship going, you've got alien feelings projected inside of you, and this is the place where the application of the countertransference comes. There's other kinds of countertransference that we would work with differently. And the atmosphere, I've already suggested to you, we want to establish a free and a thoughtful exchange of sometimes I have feelings, sometimes you have feelings. I'm having some feelings, I don't know what to do with them. I first of all thought, well, they were just my stuff, and then they kept coming back, and I thought to myself, wait a minute, I think there's something here. And then when I remember things you've told me about your mother and your father, I'm thinking, there's something about the feeling that I'm having that belongs here somewhere, and so I need to talk to you about it and see if you can help me realize how it fits. We've all been taught that we're going to avoid in countertransference simply ventilating, discharging, or confessing that I have these feelings towards you or whatever. Go talk to somebody who cares, okay, if we have that kind of a feeling. So I'm talking about the kind that we feel, we know somehow this belongs in this therapy, but I don't know quite how. Then we want to abort any sense of blame or accusation. That is, to the extent that what you just got in touch with in that little exercise is accurate and true for that person, you can be sure that other people throughout the lifetime have been having the same kind of feelings about that person and have told this person. The trouble with you is, okay, and so it comes as an accusation. And then the person either feels bad, feels humiliated, feels blamed, feels defensive, feels rageful, or whatever. So what we do want to do, we've got to, had I taken you one step further, I could have said, all right, now if you go in on Monday and say what you just said to us, to your client, what will your client's reaction be? Run out of the room screaming, refuse to pay the bill, bust you in the nose? I mean, you know, you would have known, okay? That is, you already know what that reaction is going to be, okay? And so what you want to do is, what we want to do is to try to avoid them taking this as some kind of an accusation or blame. And we also want to beware of false self-conformity. Oh, doctor, I'm sorry, I didn't want to make you mad. I won't do that anymore, which we saw in the Dora case. That is, she felt that she was making me uncomfortable by staring at me sexually, and so she mustn't do that anymore. Well, I did try to work with that false self, but I still wasn't going quite the right place with it. So we can be sure that if we're onto something really important for this client, they've heard it before, they've heard it as an accusation, and they tried to cover it up. So we're going to try to avoid those responses. Then, number 6, we could, if we wanted to begin talking about it, preface our discussion of it by our anticipated reaction. You know, I've had a feeling for a while, it's been developing, and I thought for a while maybe it's just some angry feeling that I have about my mother or something like that, but the feeling kept coming up, and then I thought, well, I really got to try to discuss this because there's a feeling that I'm having trouble with that's coming up here. And then I thought, oh my gosh, if I tell you that, you'll burst into tears and you'll feel hurt and wounded and everything. And so I've been waiting a long time, and I realize I can't wait anymore. There's some feeling that I'm having in this relationship that I need to bring up, and I need you to work with me on trying to see if we can process it. Now, I promise you, by the time you get to that level, your client's eyes are going to be big as saucers. Who has ever spoken that honestly? Who has ever said, I'm having a feeling in our relationship. It may have something or all to do with me. It may have to do with you. But our relationship is about working on feelings. It's about trying to dredge up important emotional experiences. And so if I sit here on this feeling and don't tell you about it and don't invite you to help me with it, we can't go anywhere. So I need your help. Okay? No one has ever presented this dilemma to them in that kind of light. And let's hope that our relationship is going enough to where there's enough trust. You see, I could have done that with this Dora. She loved me, she trusted me, we had a good relationship. Had I known where I was headed with it, had I known how to make use of it, she would have been very cooperative in it. At the break someone said, I think rightly so, that it's potentially, when I say that clients go after our Achilles heel, if that in some way or another is putting them down or being pejorative, that that's incorrect, but that rather that we have an Achilles heel and that we expose it and our clients go for it and it becomes a part of the communication process. And I think here, I've already told you, I think the most common error is assuming in this sort of a situation that the countertransference feeling predominantly belongs to us, even when, as in this case, I knew where I'd had this feeling before. Okay? Other people didn't stir this feeling up in me. Okay? So I think often when I'm consulting with a therapist and they'll be worried about having a certain kind of reaction, and I'll be saying, but the client before doesn't stir up this feeling, no, and the client after doesn't stir up this feeling, no, then this client knows what she's doing. So you've got to pay attention to we have to trust the client's unconscious knowledge and their unconscious intent to communicate to us. And we have to trust that they are communicating to us in every way possible, including very strong, primitive emotional exchanges. The earliest ways that babies communicate to mothers is through their feelings, through their emotional exchanges. And when early things have to be communicated, it's going to be feelings that will be communicated again. And we have to trust ourselves, and we have to trust our clients. The timing, caution. We can never be correct, and I think I've covered that. We can be ballpark correct. But since it is processed through me, exactly the way I'm feeling it, it can't possibly be correct. It points towards something. We have to rely on our client to tell us what is correct. We have to rely on them to put it into the proper metaphors. And in some of the cases this afternoon I'll be presenting, by the time I finally get something that I can say, then what follows in rapid sequence are 2 or 3 ideas that confirm it, but in much better words than I could have suggested. Right? So all we can do is to use this. It puts us in a ballpark. We're never completely correct. When can we do it? Timing. I maintained if we knew enough, we could do it in the first session. Okay? But we don't. And communication requires 2 people really knowing each other very well and then finding ways to talk to one another. So it usually is a way down the road before we're able to use this kind of interpretation. But I will say this. In myself and in other therapists that I've observed, I think we tend to wait too long. That is, I think if we had to say there's a fault, it's that we are given this material, it's processed in our own affective system, we sit on it because we don't want to get into the thicket of it, we don't have to sort through our own stuff in order that it's going to require to work with it, and so we keep putting it off and putting it off. And so I would say if there's an error there, it's usually waiting too long. And the last one, somebody always says, well, but how do we know how much is our own? Or someone will say, well, how much is my own private? How much is an appropriate reaction to the client, whatever that is, okay? And how much comes through this projected mechanism? And the answer is we'll never know. But there's one person who will. The client. Our clients will know. And so it's very easy to say, oh, you therapists all the time think these stupid things and pass right on by and wait to see whether or not it comes back to haunt the person. And often it's that we haven't said it right, our timing wasn't right, the therapy isn't far enough along. But I don't have to tell anyone here, by the time you begin to feel that there's something important and you make a statement of it, to the extent that you're on, your client will come back and will acknowledge that it's been heard. And so it becomes right as the 2 of you work with it together.